Good morning, everyone, and happy May. Welcome to another session in the Tamer Center's Social Impact webinar series. Today's topic is Nonprofit Resiliency, Responding and Rebounding During COVID-19. My name is Lon To. I'm the Associate Director for Programs and Social Enterprise in our Executive Education Division, where I focus on the learning and development of nonprofit leaders in our city and across the world. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and today I'm happy to be your moderator for this panel. Before we get started, I wanted to quickly orient you to the Zoom webinar features. I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with it by now. We want this session to be interactive, and we want to be able to answer as many questions as possible that you are bringing to this topic. So please use the Q&A box to submit your questions throughout the session. Usually that's either at the top or at the bottom of your Zoom screen, depending on your setup. We encourage you to use the upvote feature for any questions that you like and are also interested in being answered. I will do my best to monitor the questions and ask the ones that are most popular first. So let's give the Q&A box a little warm up before we meet the panel today. We have almost 60 people on the webinar today, and you represent multiple facets of the nonprofit sector. So rather than putting questions into our Q&A box, I'm going to ask you to start us off with some comments, and we can practice upvoting the comments that you agree with. So here's what I want you to think about. Share with us 3 words or ideas that come to mind when you think about nonprofit resiliency. We don't want to assume that we all know what that is. So if you could please share 3 words or ideas from where you sit today about what nonprofit resiliency is to you. So find that Q&A box, warm up your typing fingers, and don't forget to upvote or like anything that catches your attention. We'll collect your comments, and when the Q&A begins for the panel, we'll clear all those comments for questions. So again, type in 3 words, 3 ideas that come to mind when you think about nonprofit resiliency. We'll give you a few minutes to do that, but while you do that, I will introduce our panel members. Katie Leonberger, Jindasurat, and Tony Bowen. Thank you to the 3 of you for being here today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. We shared your bios in the webinar invitation, but I wanted to talk a little bit about why it's so special to have the 3 of you here for this topic today and how this all got started. So Gwen Shufro in the Tamer Center and I had an email exchange on how we can help support nonprofits in their applications for PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program. And this led me to Tony Bowen. And Tony is the lead consultant at Fiscal Management Associates, known to many nonprofits as FMA. He works out of their DC office and has been following the guidance up to the minute on PPP. He's hosted numerous webinars and helped put together the PPP toolbox on the FMA website and hosts multiple public and private PPP clinics each week. First of all, thank you for creating that hub of resources, Tony. It's been very helpful to a number of organizations I've worked with. My colleague Karen Bridges is going to share the link to the FMA toolbox in the chat feature as we speak. So Tony and I talked about PPP, and the big conclusion we had is that the Paycheck Protection Program is a piece in a much larger puzzle of how nonprofits are trying to survive and thrive during this pandemic. That led us to Katie Leonberger, President and CEO of Community Resource Exchange in New York City. Katie and her staff at CRE have been working closely with nonprofits in understanding and mitigating the risks that this current crisis has on organizations, their staff, communities, both through the lens of the immediate and as well as the long-term impacts. CRE is actually hosting a webinar this afternoon about risk management for nonprofits, and we'll provide that link in the chat feature for anyone who would like to register. And I wanted to thank Katie for being here today as well. Finally, every week since sheltering in started, a number of us have been paying more attention to a weekly email in our inbox from Nonprofit New York with the subject line, the Policy and Resource Roundup. During this pandemic, Nonprofit New York has been tremendous in highlighting COVID-19's impact on the sector. The policy analysis they've been churning out during this difficult time is led by their policy director, Jindasurat. Chai, thank you also for being here today and bringing your expertise. So the three of you represent some critical dimensions in how nonprofits can respond and rebound in this era of COVID-19. We have a financial perspective, an organizational perspective, and the political dimension. Businesses and organizations across the board are trying to sustain their staff and their existence during this particular time. And for nonprofits, a number of them have also faced increased demand for their services and programs, along with the reduction of diminishing resources. So it's not an unusual state of being for some of our organizations, but certainly it's much more compounded now than before. So, so that is how and why we decided to focus on this topic during one of our social impact webinars. And I'm going to look at some of the comments that people have shared. And the thoughts around nonprofit resiliency include sustainability, agility, adaptability, securing funding, risk management, employee well-being, creative and being creative, resourceful, and constant, flexibility, empathy, humility. Those are a few of the terms that have popped up. So I'm going to turn the commentary to our panel to help us think through what is nonprofit resiliency and what's important for nonprofits to focus on right now. We'll start with Tony and then Katie and end with Chai. And at this time, I'm going to clear the Q&A box of comments and invite the audience to feel free to ask questions as each panelist is sharing their thoughts. And don't forget to upvote questions that you really want answered, and we'll get to them after we hear from each of the panelists. So Tony, I am happy to hand this off to you first. What are your perspectives from where you are?
Great. Thanks, Lan. Can I get a thumbs up from my fellow panelists if you can see my screen? Excellent. All right, thank you. Thank you, Lan, so much for having me and the Columbian Tamer team. Happy to dive in here. As Lan mentioned, my name is Tony Bowen. I use he, him, his pronouns. Coming to you today from DC, although my background is where I am from in Massachusetts. So yeah, happy to dive into how FMA thinks about what is nonprofit resiliency. And I'm going to do so within a financial context, knowing that Katie and Chai will speak to other ways that nonprofits think about resiliency, just like how you all responded in different ways within the Q&A box. So when we think about financial resiliency, financial resilient nonprofits are those that are staying focused on the long term while continuously assessing and responding to current needs. We see that financially resilient nonprofits understand and are able to tell their financial story. They are ready to weather a storm, and they are ready to step up when their communities need them most. And that's fairly, I think, aligned with what, a lot of folks just said in terms of the financial piece of this. At FMA, we use a financial resiliency framework to ground all of the work that we do. Ultimately, what we are trying to do is try to build financially resilient organizations. But it's important to keep in mind that, when we talk about financial resilience, it is a journey. And it is a path that people continuously are on. One of the values for us of financial resilience is continuous improvement, and so we see financial resilience as a journey that people are on. So this is a framework that we often use to help folks sort of ground themselves in what is financial resilience. And for us, it starts with values. At the core of a financial resilient organization is its values. These values are held high to inform the practices that nonprofits have in place, and they are informed by a nonprofit's resources. Ultimately, values are how we do the work. And, while we are moving quickly and without a lot of certainty, our values allow us to create a clear picture of who we want to be. And we know that this time of crisis will shape who we become. So if we pause to assess our values in moments like this, we will then have the ability to be more intentional about how we move forward. So as you'll see here, in addition to talking about inclusivity, our practices that we often see in financially resilient organizations are those who participate in planning, who think about their operations and their systems and their people, and then they have ways to do performance management. Do we understand our cash on hand? Do we understand how our assets are shifting? And then lastly, what I love about this last ring around resources is these are the things you get if you employ these values and these practices: effective leadership teams, capital for change and security, and a sustainable business model. But they are also what is necessary for the practices in order for those to be in place. So that's sort of how we think about financial resiliency at FMA. Want to dive in next to the second question, Lan, that you said, so sort of what's important for nonprofits to think about right now. So as Lan mentioned, originally how we started this conversation was a conversation about the Paycheck Protection Program. When we took a look at the CARES Act, we noticed that of all the components that we saw, it was the Paycheck Protection Program that seemed the most appealing to nonprofits in order to help them survive through this moment right now. A lot of you joining will probably be somewhat familiar with the program, but just to ground the conversation, when we talk about what do nonprofits need to be doing right now, for a lot of nonprofits, they need to be taking this program seriously to see if it's a solution for them. And I'll talk about why in a second. But just the quick 2 seconds is that it's a loan that's administered by the SBA, designed to incentivize nonprofits and small businesses to either keep their workers on payroll or bring them back if you've had to do layoffs. In order to incentivize that behavior, the SBA will forgive those loans if the employees are kept on payroll for 8 weeks after the funds are received, and so long as the money is used for specific purposes. As Lan mentioned, I can do hours on PPP. I'll stop here right now in terms of the basics of the program. But one of the reasons that it's so important is that for so many nonprofits that were hit hard and continue to be hit hard by what's happening with COVID, both financially, but also in terms of employee wellness, we really see that PPP was a triage moment. Like we're in crisis. We need something to help in this moment right now. It's only 8 weeks of payroll, but for some organizations, that's what they need right now. And so PPP we really see as an opportunity to help organizations stabilize. We can't go into that planning mode that I mentioned earlier if we don't have the actual financial resources to pause and really think about how do we look at our future if we're still worried about how we're going to make payroll next week. So for those of you that have applied for PPP loans, I really encourage you to use this moment after you've received the money to do some planning. And I'll let Katie talk about in a second sort of some different options to think about scenario planning. The next sort of part that we're seeing in terms of like what do you need to do as it relates to PPP, if you've applied, we really need people to pay attention to how you're going to manage the loan and how you're going to end up getting forgiveness. We can't be on that pathway to recover if we end up with if we still continue to have a large loan on our books. We want to make sure that we are getting forgiveness through the PPP program. Ultimately, what we're hoping is that this short-term infusion allows people to plan so that they can be on a pathway to recovery, to reinvention, and then, as Lan mentioned earlier, to thrive. And so as Lan mentioned, PPP is one piece of it, but we really see the next 8 to 12 months with PPP just being the beginning of what people can do. My other sort of takeaways in terms of what can folks be doing right now in this moment if you're a nonprofit, 3 main things. The first one is understand your current financial position. The next is to identify implications and scenarios that could be in your future, and then manage to those scenarios by managing your cash flow. When we talk about understanding your current financial position, this is what do you have for resources right now to make key decisions and how liquid are those resources? When we think about scenario planning in a financial context, we're looking at how might our revenue get affected? How might our expenses shift as a result? And then once we have identified those scenarios, how are we going to pay for it? Are we going to use financing options like loans, lines of credit, or something very different, which is actual revenue that we would receive through philanthropy or through earned revenue? Those are sort of some key things that you can be doing right now as a nonprofit. So with that, I am going to, I guess my only other sort of what we're seeing in nonprofits that I would just share is in terms of what you should be doing right now is communicate, communicate, communicate. Make sure your staff and your board have a clear understanding of what's going on while managing expectations, that funders understand your financial position and what you're facing, and that your clients and constituents hear from you on how you're able to best meet their needs. So with that, I will turn it over to Katie and then do some Q&A later.
Thank you, Tony. Appreciate that. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Lon, for having me and the rest of the Columbia and Tamer team. Really excited to be talking to everybody today. Pronouns are she, her, hers, and as Lon mentioned, I am President and CEO of CRE, also a proud Columbia grad from the business school, so really excited to be able to do this. I'm also going to try to share my screen here, so let's see how I do. And similarly, will my fellow panelists just give a thumbs up if you can see this? Awesome, thank you. Okay, so to dive in, right, maybe also to answer the question of how CRE and I think about nonprofit resiliency, I can share that CRE is a nonprofit consulting firm here in New York City. We've been around for 40 years, and our whole mission is to support and strengthen other nonprofits, as well as foundations and government agencies, to be more effective in achieving their missions. And we do this through really strategy and management and organizational development support of all aspects of an organization's operations. So given that overview of what we do, we take a very holistic perspective to what nonprofit resiliency means. And in particular, we look at all different parts of an organization to define what is a resilient organization. And in the context of COVID-19, we also think of it as relates to risk. And for us, with our risk engagement practice at CRE, it's one of many practice areas we have. We see risk as having two equally important sides, right? Like there's the downsides of risk, the things you want to mitigate, and the things that we think a lot about in a crisis are like all the negative parts of risk. But there's also an upside to risk, right? Like inherent in any crisis are also opportunities that organizations can create and or leverage because there are new needs emerging, new things have to be addressed amongst the communities and constituencies that we as nonprofits serve. And so that's an important side to think about in any conversation around resilience as well. And so CRE's, maybe I'm not able to advance this, there we go. CRE's definition of risk of resilience in this context is really around risk resilience. And that for us is being able to survive and also succeed in an uncertain environment. So risk resilience for us is around being able to anticipate and adapt to change, being able to manage through and recover from any number of risk events. And then importantly, again, on the upside of risk, capitalizing on opportunities that are going to arise during a crisis like this. And then importantly, being really creative with the use of resources, supports, and partners. So absolutely financial resources, as well as how you partner and network and connect to your communities, your funders, your peer organizations. All of that stuff comes in really handy and important during a time like this, particularly because we're in a kind of extended moment of crisis, right? This isn't a one and done moment. This is continuing in a very unprecedented way. And so when we think about risk resilience and all the different facets of an organization you want to be thinking about, CRE has, again, as part of our risk practice, has defined essentially 6 main risk categories and then subcategories. I'm not going to read through all these, but I put it up here just for a moment to share, again, how holistic you should be thinking right now as you think about a resilient organization, and to challenge everyone to think beyond what I kind of call the predictable areas of risk, so compliance, finance, personnel, and admin, to also be thinking about your leadership, your governance, your strategy, how your programs and services are delivered, if they're impactful, if they're meeting the real-time needs right now of your communities, and importantly, what else is happening in the external environment, everything from, of course, the health pandemic, as well as, reputationally, how folks are perceiving the work that you're doing, et cetera. So again, thinking really holistic as you think about resilience is one of my big messages today. And then kind of key to think about right now, right? Like there's 2 things that I hope you'll take from what are the things that Katie thinks that you recommend you think about right now. One is time frame and the imperative to be thinking long-term at the same time that you're trying to do that short-term stabilization that Tony was talking about. And then two, the role that scenario planning can play for any organization, regardless of size and regardless of how much time you have to do scenario planning. I can promise you an hour spent doing a quick scenario plan with members of your team will go a long way in helping your organization be able to figure out what it can control and be able to navigate this situation as best you can. So in terms of the time frame, right, the one thing we've been challenging all of our clients who we work with is around how do you, again, stabilize in the short term, but also think about the long term. Like, this is not going away anytime soon. And so very much as Tony was talking about with the graphic that he showed, there's multiple phases of this crisis in particular, and I don't pretend to be the expert on this, but kind of the different phases that we've mapped out and been talking about at CRE is number one, of course, like the immediate short-term crisis management piece of it. This is how are you as an organization managing the health impacts of the pandemic, keeping your team safe, doing remote work when you can, and really getting your teams up and running. You might be needing to potentially shift and pivot services, either the actual services you're delivering to meet community needs and or how you deliver services, if that's an option. Funding is a key role here, as we know. And then, really mapping out, are you an organization where your entire team can work remote? You can't work remote because you're essential services and or there's a hybrid. And in some cases, some of the hybrids was some of the first organizations to lay off staff because they weren't actually able to deliver services, but they weren't essential services. And so lost funding immediately, unfortunately. So that's kind of the very first phase. That's the stabilization piece. And throughout that, there have been a couple of themes or issues that we at CRE have seen coming up. So I'll put these up here if they're of interest and maybe to see if they resonate with everyone. But we launched essentially a hotline, advisory calls with any nonprofit that wanted support back at the beginning of March. We're still doing these, and you're welcome to sign up on our website. Essentially, it's an hour call to talk with a senior consultant at CRE. And these are some of the themes that came up, and they very much map to what we were just talking about, right? Like funding and sustainability being critical for everybody. Managing the team morale, particularly if you're an organization where you've had team members get sick and or pass away, clients, the same thing. And this stuff is really heavy for an organization to manage. And then also, how do you, of course, just build your team and support your team while you're working remotely. So all of that is real. And as we continue in the remote work mode too, there's a lot around kind of screen fatigue and meeting fatigue and what needs to happen there. Because of that, self-care is a huge theme. And then also board governance and engagement, right? How you engage your board in the right ways and the most useful ways for us as leaders of organizations to really advance the work that you're doing. Because I think many boards do really want to support right now. So how do you leverage and direct that energy in the right way? I would say though, if that's the first phase, and I would argue for most organizations, we're past that phase now, or we're just coming out of it. And we're into that stability / into the new reality. I hesitate to call it normal, but the new reality that we're in. This next phase, while we continue, of course, to manage all the health piece of this, is also the economic fallout. And what we're anticipating will be a recession. Again, I am no economist, so don't quote me on any of this stuff. There are much smarter people at Columbia who can talk about that. But we are anticipating, I think we have to, as nonprofits and as the social sector, that there is going to be government cuts. That's very clear coming out of the state and the city already. Many nonprofits in New York City, at least, are dreading seeing what the city budget is going to look like very shortly for starting the year on July 1. They've already cut all the summer youth programs, which is devastating for many nonprofits. Folks are worried about other youth programs for the rest of the year, as one example. But then there's also the question around what's going to happen with foundation funding. Endowments are down. Some foundations I've heard are already pulling back on giving at the same time that they're doing rapid response giving. The longer term giving is not clear as to what the path will be. And then, so that'll happen for however long, right? And then there's also the community rebuilding and the organizational rebuilding piece, and what we hope will become a new normal, in which actually some of our really broken systems will be disrupted and new paths forward will be found. I think that the nonprofit and larger social sector have a huge role to play in that. And so again, this idea of thinking about the longer term in the hopes that every nonprofit can be part of changing these systems for the better as we move forward. That's part of that long-term planning that you can start now, if you don't get to work on that until later. So with those phases, I'm challenging everyone to say, focusing on the short term, of course, we need to for survival and sustainability. And also, you should be looking and planning 12 to 18 months out, really assessing where your organization is and what's going to be needed. And to operate and to be effective and impactful 18 months from now, which is what many leaders right now are looking at when they're doing their scenario planning. Which brings me to my next point. So scenario planning, again, from CRE's perspective, is essentially how do you take a holistic, organizational-wide lens, which is critical to do right now in a world of total uncertainty, right? Like we really don't know what's going to happen, and I think if anything, we need to expect the worst is going to happen at this point. We also can't predict the future. I certainly can't. Yet, as leaders of organizations, we still need to make decisions today that are going to impact whatever's happening for us in an unknown future world. So what is scenario planning? It's essentially the activity that allows you to do that, right? You visualize different possible futures, and then it helps you decide what in those given plausible futures you should be doing now to be able to make decisions in the future. So I want to emphasize, this is not about predicting the future. It's about preparing for what events might occur. And that's why it is, I think, an interesting activity, because you actually get to envision, and I always say simplified best case and worst case, and then map out how you achieve the best results for your organization in either world. So let me just give you a very quick view of what the process looks like. Don't worry about all the small words on the page. The most important steps to pay attention to, particularly in a moment of crisis, are number 3, start by outlining the best and worst case scenarios. And if you're really short on time, like right now, focus on the worst case scenario. I was saying to the panelists just earlier this week that we did a worst case scenario activity with 8 CEOs sometime in February, who 100% predicted what was going to happen in New York City around coronavirus. Although at the time for us, that was a crazy outlandish worst case scenario, and it has all come to pass. So this stuff can really be useful. You basically map out what can happen in the external world. What's the world going to look like around my organization? Map out the worst case. And then you say, what are the best possible results our organization can achieve in this worst case? If we take this as reality, what's the best we can see and we can do? And then to achieve those best possible results, step 4, what are the actions you need to take now to achieve those best possible results? And then of course, down the road as well. If you do this in a world where you map out best and worst case, you can then come back together as a team, that's step 5, and say, given we don't know which way the world's gonna go, what are obvious things we do now regardless? And then what are other things we should be thinking about depending on which way the world goes? This is a really helpful exercise because it allows you to be proactive in your management versus being reactive. And a very simple set of vectors you could use if you wanted to do this for an hour or 2 of a team meeting later this week, or today's Friday, next week, is thinking about what happens to the economic uncertainty and what happens around the health and the parts of this pandemic and social distancing, right? Those are 2 key vectors that are going to determine what we all need to be doing as organizations and what our communities are going to need. You could map those out in 2 different directions, and you'll have some very clear action steps you would take in either world. So I would say scenario planning is something that everyone should be thinking about. It is very straightforward to do. You can see from the steps on the page, and it allows you to emerge with a path that you can take for the future, helping you identify the things that you and your organization can control and start moving on those. I will say, particularly because Tony talked about the financial piece of this earlier, financial contingency planning in a world of scenario planning is critical. And what you can often do is start with this big picture view around looking at what's happening programmatically, what's happening with your team, what's happening financially at a high level from something like I'm talking about, and then do a second level, much more detailed on the finance side, because you do need to look at all the different sources of funds as well. I will leave it there for now. I think I've probably talked too long, and I will turn it over to Chai. Let's see if I can stop my share here, and thank you.
All right, hi everyone. Okay, so I am going to try my best to share my screen. This is the first time I'm doing a okay. So panelists, can you see my screen? Okay, great. Now, can you still see it if I do this? Does that ruin it?
Yeah.
Okay, so all right, so if I do this, then I don't have my notes because they're on a Google Doc, but yeah, I'll go ahead and just, okay, so I'm Chai, Jindasurat. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the policy director at Nonprofit New York. Thank you for inviting me, Lon, to do this today. Apologies, I don't have a very detailed slide deck. It's been quite a week, as a lot of us have been saying every week. And I guess I'll just do this from what an old organizer mentor of mine called grandma style, which is when you just kind of sit and talk. So I guess there's a few pieces that I think are important for me to add to this discussion about nonprofit resiliency, and the role of advocacy and the role of how important it's been for nonprofits to engage in advocacy to make sure that we are included in different pieces of massive federal relief and legislation, like Tony was talking about with the CARES Act and the PPP loan program. And so I wanted to do just a kind of a retrospective and then a forward-looking piece to this. And so for the retrospective, I wanted to just back up to where we were before COVID-19 and some of the things that Nonprofit New York was working on in terms of advocacy. So at Nonprofit New York, we are a membership-based organization. We have about 1,500 nonprofit members, and we work to strengthen and unite the sector, primarily in the New York City area, although we do have members in Westchester and Long Island. And with our advocacy work, it's actually the history of our organization. So in the 80s, there was a property tax proposal for cultural organizations, cultural nonprofits, and this committee came together, committee of lawyers, and worked to defeat it, and then said, hey, let's continue to meet, and the organization was formed from there. A lot of the work went very much into capacity building and the Nonprofit Excellence Awards, which is kind of one of our signature programs. And we have areas of nonprofit excellence. And we recently added, I would say maybe 2 years ago, advocacy and strategic partnerships as an area of nonprofit excellence. So we feel like holistically, advocacy and strategic partnerships are just as important as things like financial management and fundraising and diversity and equity and inclusion. And all of these things intersect. So our previous CEO, Sharon Staple, and Toloma Jayasinghe, who was our chief programs officer, worked with an action committee to develop a proactive or more bold framework for the kind of policy work we wanted to do, and developed something that we called a nonprofit declaration of nonprofit rights. And so we launched this last March, which feels like a million years ago. It was my first month starting at Nonprofit New York. Before that, I was working for the city. And there are basically 4 principles of the declaration. The first is that nonprofits have a right to engage. Nonprofits have a right to sustainable financial resources. The second is that nonprofits have a right to engage in advocacy and a responsibility to share our expertise. And so that's the one I'll really focus on, of course, within the context of financial sustainability and resiliency. The third is that nonprofits have a right to champion equity and have an equitable workforce. And the fourth is that nonprofits have a right to be powerful forces for change. And all of these principles have just been, like so many things from COVID-19, magnified and put into just very concrete perspective, whereas before they may have seemed a bit more esoteric or conceptual. And so what we did with these was we basically built a policy platform around our declaration, doing literature reviews, stakeholder convenings, research, and we learned about a couple of things. So we learned about different initiatives across the country led by organizations like the Nonprofit Finance Fund, FMA, Tony's organization, Bridgespan, the Bridgespan Group, that really kind of focused on true cost work, where nonprofits work to understand, what it means to actually be financially sustainable, as opposed to just kind of getting by on what contracts you're given or what funding you're given, and piecing things together. It feels somewhat like a social movement, and so there were various different tools, practices, trainings, as well as convenings between funders and nonprofits. I think probably the most well-known, that's put out a few reports, is happened in California with the regional grant makers. So we thought this would be a really interesting thing to bring to New York, to build out for our sustainable nonprofits principle of the declaration, because, you know, we had seen a lot of movement around things like making sure that organizations had their actual indirect cost rates reimbursed, which was a huge challenge for a really long time. I worked at OMB when we were putting together that city policy, the standard policy for reimbursing organizations, and you know, what the rates were prior to that were really, really just so harmful for organizations, because you cannot operate on such low indirect cost rates. But we wanted to kind of shift the conversation and start with like, okay, what are all the things that an organization needs to be financially sustainable, as opposed to taking, you know, a very restricted grant and piecing it together and filling in the holes wherever we could. And so we thought, okay, you know, we want to reject this notion that that there are benchmarks like an overhead ratio or program services ratio that actually equate to effectiveness and outcomes. Like that's not how we should be measuring how well an organization is achieving its mission, and whether or not, you know, people should be donating to it. Or and then we also wanted to really reject the practice of restricting dollars to the T, and also restricting lines for things like reserves, because we just fundamentally feel that organizations have to have reserves to be able to be financially sustainable. And that has all been magnified because of COVID-19 and the onset of the recession that it's brought. So that's a little bit of background on that project. As a part of this, we basically had like working groups, and we're continuing to convene, and we're trying to build out some research and programming, when at the very beginning of March, one of our members, who is part of our Policy Leadership Council, asked if we would consider putting out a message to funders about the sector's concerns about COVID-19, and just seeing how a lot of things were about to shut down, and people were becoming very afraid, and New York was having its, you know, the cases were just starting to grow. And so we said, of course, yeah, we'd be happy to do that. So we started just listening I basically did like a mini listening tour. I tried to contact as many folks in different subsectors and organizations as I could to be like, okay, what are you worried about, and what do you want to tell funders, so we could like present this message. And at the same time, I reached out to Philanthropy New York and asked if we could do something on this, and they invited me to be part of a webinar to share basically a message from the sector with a few other panelists for, you know, funders in the New York to start thinking about like how should we start to prepare. And basically that's when our, you know, alarm really was sounded, because organizations were extremely concerned. There were, I would say, I'm going to like generalize and group organizations into a couple different buckets. So there were organizations that were kind of fee-for-service models, and they were like, we're reimbursed based on how many people we serve and the number of units or whatever we achieve, and that's all going to change. And we need assurances that we'll still be able to be reimbursed, or we'll still have a continuity of cash flow if that doesn't happen. And we're also concerned about what it means to miss our deliverables. And please, you know, express to funders that we don't want to be held, you know, we don't want to be judged by missing deliverables from this period of time we're about to go through. And then there were the organizations that were having to, that were really concerned about canceled events. So I would say arts and culture organizations in particular, very, very reliant on in-person, people coming in events. It's a huge source of their revenue, as well as just all the different fundraisers that organizations have. And all of those things were starting to be canceled, closed. Nobody was sure about what kind of funding was going to come in. So our main recommendations to funders were to be flexible, to lift restrictions into general operating support, to start to think about funding for rapid response initiatives, to send messages of support to their grantees, because everybody was really concerned. And then basically we sent out a message we put it into a document, sent out a message, and then through that process, I kind of circled back with a lot of organizations and was like, okay, what's going on? Because it looks like there was just the policy wheels were really starting to turn at the city level, at the state level, at the federal level. I was in Albany advocating for a completely different campaign the day that the state legislature granted Governor Cuomo, new executive powers, emergency powers that have really shifted the policy landscape. This was in early March. The federal government was looking at passing major paid sick and family leave policies through Families First. The city was basically not giving out appropriate guidance to their contracted providers on whether or not they would be reimbursed. So I held an open call and I said, whoever wants to come to this. It was originally about like 30 to 40 policy focused umbrella organizations, but also some individual organizations that are engaged in policy advocacy. And it ended up being a call with about 75 people because people were just like forwarding. They were like, yes, so like we need to come together and think about what to do. And this was maybe like March 10th. And it was really, really concerning because organizations were like, if the city does not tell us whether or not they're going to reimburse us for our contracts, because we're literally not able to serve people in our shelter, we're literally not able to have people go to certain things because of things are closing down, we may not make it 2 to 3 weeks from now. So everything felt like it was about to collapse. And, the stock market was falling. Like it was just a very, very intense time. So it felt like we needed to send out a very bold statement. So we basically worked on an open letter to our government partners, city, state, federal, very bold, used the word demand, which is an organizing term that, in more professional and polite policy advocacy, you don't use. You say like, we recommend, we make the following recommendations, but no, we were like, we demand because we are going to collapse and we're critical for the city's survival. And, it was really just, I don't even know what the word was, but almost 500 organizations signed on. And it was just it was a very powerful moment, but also kind of like a scary moment. So then we just started having weekly calls, meetings. We put together a listserv. There's like 100 organizations on. We're kind of, that's like our centralized way of coordinating sector-wide advocacy. And I would say that how this all ties into resiliency is one, we knew before that 40% of nonprofits, based on research from Sea Change Capital Partners, did not have cash reserves, virtually no cash reserves. We knew that less than 30% of nonprofits in New York City were not financially strong based on an analysis that they did. Going into this, we knew that organizations were not resilient, and then this has just like magnified it. So, unfortunately, we have seen closures, we have seen layoffs, we have seen organizations budgets significantly reduced. But also we've seen nonprofits specifically included in pieces of legislation because of advocacy. So for Families First, the quarterly reimbursement model, which I'll break down, basically Families First was passed before CARES Act, and Families First expands paid sick and family leave for the duration. Well, we're now realizing it's not actually the duration of the virus, but significantly expanded it for lots of different types of people, but not everyone. And the way that they funded it, the way that they provided relief to businesses and nonprofits is that they can claim a quarterly payroll tax deduction. So historically, these types of things were given to for-profit corporations as corporate income tax deductions or credits, but because nonprofits don't pay corporate income taxes, this was a way that nonprofits could be included, and this was like specifically because of nonprofit advocacy. Same thing with CARES. So the reason why nonprofits are included in PPP is because nonprofits advocated. There was a very robust nationally coordinated effort for nonprofits to be included. And there's other pieces of CARES where nonprofits are included, but I think today we're fairly interested in focusing on PPP. But at the same time, you know, that was a process that was pretty rushed. And so we're seeing, now we're seeing the outcomes of PPP and what needs to be fixed for the next round, which is going to happen potentially within the next couple of weeks. And so, you know, while we're very grateful that nonprofits are specifically included, nonprofit business models weren't really taken into account. So when a lot of organizations were filling it out, they were like, nobody owns a nonprofit. What do we put in that category for the application? So that was a point of confusion for a lot of groups. But because, you know, it was basically like a business model for small businesses that nonprofits were tacked onto. And we've seen a few different ways through a lot of this, the policy work that's been happening now, how that can be problematic. And then the cap on employees. So the cap of 500 employees, totally understand that they were trying to make this intended for small businesses, but because in New York City and specifically, years of chronic underfunding, suppressed indirect rates, very restrictive grants, a lot of organizations had to merge, particularly very big human service organizations. And so, you know, these are organizations that'll be critical for our city's survival. It doesn't make up a huge amount of the types of nonprofits in New York City, but they're very substantial in terms of the services that they're providing. They're ineligible for PPP, which is a forgivable loan program. We found out yesterday the Main Street Lending Program, which was supposed to, we thought was intended for the larger organizations. It did come with an interest rate. It was not forgivable, but we thought it would be available for nonprofits. Although we found out yesterday the Treasury announced they are not included, although this is like some advocacy we've been working on for a couple of weeks to try and get clarity. And it's our understanding that the Fed is seriously considering creating a separate program for nonprofits, which actually would probably be better. The only thing is these big organizations needed access to relief about a month ago. So that's a little bit on how we were specifically included in CARES. And then, you know, at the state and city level, yeah, I'll just echo what everybody else has said. You know, the city and state are broke. Not all nonprofits have government contracts, but a lot do. And we're just very concerned that nonprofits are going to be the first to be cut. And in particular, that small grassroots organizations led by people of color serving people who are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 are going to feel the crunch. So the issue of the past week has been council discretionary contracts, city council discretionary contracts, as well as the announcement by the Department of Budget on the state level over the weekend that there's going to be an across the board $10 billion reduction in the state budget, and an $8 billion of which is aid to localities. And a lot of that is what supports nonprofit programming. Discretionary contracts, city council contracts, very small part of the budget, but it's an easy cut for the city to make. So right now, I could go into the technical minutia of where we are, but I think I'll hold off for the sake of time. We can get into discussion. But just, I did want to highlight a couple other examples of when we're not part of the conversation, what some of the unintended consequences are. So I forget which week it was, maybe 2, maybe 3. The Summer Youth Employment Program for the city was announced that it was going to be cut. And it was, they gave nonprofits 24 hours to completely close their operations. So a lot of layoffs happened after that. And there was a big backlash. And what it actually did was it made certain nonprofits ineligible for PPP, because PPP stands for the, protection program, payroll, something like that. Basically, it's trying to keep people on your payroll, trying to keep people on staff, keep jobs there. So because nonprofits had to lay off people because SYEP was cut very quickly, they were then ineligible for the PPP loans. And then when organizations told the city that, they were like, oh, you know, that's terrible. And it's kind of like, okay, yes. And that's what happens when you don't consult organizations and you make across the board decisions that are going to negatively affect them. And that's why it's just so important for us to make sure sure that we are part of the legislation. We are telling our stories, because if we don't, you know, things are moving very quickly and we're going to be left out somehow. With PPP, there's been we need a lot more data on who has had access to that. It's something we're actively working with Congresswoman Nydia Velazquez's office on. She's chair of the Small Business Committee for the House side, you know, represents many parts of New York City. And SBA hasn't released that data, but what we have seen, there's been a couple of surveys. Let me see if I get this right without my notes. So of nonprofits that did not, there was a recent survey published in Nonprofit Times yesterday of nonprofits that did not get access, did not get granted the PPP loans. 25% are laying off staff. So we know, you know, these decisions are happening very quickly. I would say adding another equity piece to the PPP loan program is that it's a first come, first serve basis. What we've learned afterwards is that organizations that had a pre-existing relationship with their banks more likely to get a loan. We also learned, you know, smaller organizations led by people of color, sometimes with language barriers, had a much harder time getting access to the loans, and then the funding ran out. So these are all the things that we really need to be mindful of as we think about the next round of congressional action. Yeah, I think I will stop there. My screen just disappeared, so.
Thanks, Chai. Thank you so much. And thanks, Katie and Tony, too. While you were sharing your perspectives, I looked at the opening words again around nonprofit resiliency. And a number of the words that came up were around adaptability, flexibility, resourcefulness, creativity, agility, nimbleness, but also around mission relevance, ability to deliver mission, adapting mission, and adapting services. And, you know, Chai, you mentioned Seed Change Capital Partners, and they did a great report around types of nonprofits that are, or types of responses for certain nonprofits around COVID-19, that you're a nonprofit who either has services that is hibernating right now because they're like museums, people can't go to museums right now, or your responders and your services have increased, or you're a hybrid where you have a mix of both hibernating programs as well as programs that are in high demand right now. And that I wanted to share that because one of the questions that came out from the audience is around how an organization should think about pivoting their mission or their core services in some way in order to feel more relevant in this current crisis. Do you have thoughts around that? And you know, Katie or Tony, Chai, to start.
Yeah, I'm happy to dive in.
Thanks.
I think one of the first things I would say is there's a difference between kind of pivoting your mission and pivoting your services. And for most organizations, I would argue, I wouldn't start thinking pivoting your mission unless you've actually talked about it with your board. There's a real governance issue there, et cetera. But I do think that there's many organizations where they are saying exactly that, like particularly a lot of like the community development type organizations, direct service organizations that already have multiple types of services, where they're seeing all sorts of new needs, and they also are finding that the older services that they were delivering aren't currently relevant or possible to be delivered in the same way, and so they're actually able to shift some of their team. So, you know, to give an example, I was on the phone yesterday with the executive director of an organization that does community development in a particular neighborhood, and you know, they also get government funds, and one of the government funds they have, some of those contracts are for youth development, which are drastically shifting in terms of how they deliver those services right now. So they're still doing that, but it's happening remotely. And so two things are happening. One, how they're delivering the existing services change, and they're also finding that there's a need to actually purchase equipment so that youth who don't otherwise have access to remote learning capabilities can actually have iPads now and can have the internet paid for, et cetera. So there's that happening. That's kind of an obvious, like, just you have to get the approval of your funders to do that. And it's not, I guess I should pause, it's not an easy, you just have to get that, because not every funder is flexible in that way, though they should be. And then the second piece is if you don't need to fully deploy all of your team to the service they were previously delivering, if they are qualified and able to pivot to other things, as a couple of examples being like food distribution right now, particularly if you're serving immigrant communities, particularly with undocumented immigrants, those folks don't want to leave home right now for multiple reasons, but a lot of it being that they don't want to run into ICE on their way to the grocery store, which has happened. And so therefore they're staying home, they're actually not eating and not able to feed their families. And so some of these community development organizations in this example want to be able to actually shift into food delivery. And they've actually, in some cases, actually got a distribution point for food, but it's a question of how do you deliver it and who are you paying to do that work? And will your government contract allow you to make that shift if you're doing youth development otherwise, and or will private funders help make that argument and help you shift their funds for you? And then another big one right now that we're seeing in communities is like actually helping families pay for funerals, right? Like that is a huge unexpected expense for many people in many communities right now. And particularly because we know that disproportionately communities of color are the ones that are most impacted with a lot of the deaths that have happened out of COVID-19. The communities of color in particular, if they are low income, they're not always, right, to be very clear on that, but like where there are needs and how can you pivot your services has been a really big question. And so number one is getting approval from your funders, and number two, can you work with your board and others and then advocate if your funders aren't giving you that support. And then the third piece being, how do you identify those opportunities if you have, it's not obvious to you, and that's where, again, thinking about the scenario planning can come in and be really helpful.
Thanks, Katie. Tony or Chad, do you have any thoughts around that? Mission pivots? No?
Not on mission pivot, but service pivot. I mean, I would just say from a policy perspective, a lot of organizations are doing surveys and trying to get a sense of what the needs are. You know, it's kind of like a from the ground up model, which I think is the way to do it. So it's a hard balance of like asking what your communities need, but I think what we found is people really want to tell organizations what they need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. So this next question is for Tony, and really for any of the panelists around PPP. Are there certain experiences that you can share that you're aware of from other nonprofits and how they're applying for PPP and the process of getting the loan or not getting it, and any tips for nonprofits as they're applying for this next round?
Yeah, sure thing. And welcome other folks to add in here. So I think in terms of, as we think about what the nonprofit experience has been, I actually really like and agree with a lot of what Chai said throughout his talking points in terms of, you know, this program was not designed for nonprofits, but it was inclusive of nonprofits. And this is one of the first times that the SBA has ever had a program that nonprofits could actively apply to. And so that means a little bit of having to fit into their system and their way of doing things when it doesn't always fit nicely for nonprofits. I think the nonprofits that we are seeing who have had the most success with the PPP, first off, it comes down to the lender, right? What bank are you using? What lender do you have? And for some folks, and for those of you who have applied, I feel like in the second round, most people are applying through 2 to 3 lenders because they're realizing that that they don't want to put all their eggs in one basket. And when the program first started, folks were hesitant to go to more than one bank, but then it became very evident that that was necessary in order to secure the funding. And so having that lender that's willing to work with you is important. And I think, you know, the banking industry is set up as, through its regulations, as a relational business, right? It is about do you know your customers? Who do you have relationships with? And so to the extent that you're a nonprofit that's still trying to figure out which lender to use, we'll share our contact information afterwards. We have a good number of lenders that have been nonprofit friendly, that have carved out in this round 2 of funding specific ways to get to them just for nonprofits, and we're starting to see some success there. So first off, it starts with your lender. I think the second is those that are getting through the fastest are those who have provided accurate calculations and the right documents. Keep in mind that the lenders are just like you and I sitting at home in front of our computer trying to do as much work as possible. And therefore, those organizations that give lenders clean data that's ready to go are going to be the easy ones to just keep pushing through and go for review. And so we do encourage folks to like really look through the documentation requirements carefully. Every lender is asking for slightly different stuff in order to meet their own requirements that they have. And if folks need more resources, we have a bunch of resources on the toolbox on how to apply, tips and tricks, and things like that. So do take the time to sort of get the calculations and the documents right so that your application has an increased chance of flying through. And I think my next sort of tip or trick is around what we're seeing is there was so much franticness around like how do we get access, which was the right decision. Like let's focus on access. But now people have a lot of questions about how do I best manage the loan now that I've received it. For most nonprofits, they've never received a loan before. And so everything from what do I need to do in QuickBooks in order to actually properly book this to strategic questions around, wait, I laid off 4 people last month because I was forced to. I think I can bring back 3. How do I make these strategic decisions about who's going to best be, and how will that affect the actual forgiveness that we receive? So I highly encourage folks to start thinking about how are we going to manage this and how are we going to tee ourselves up for forgiveness. So yeah, I think those are some of the themes that I'm seeing around the nonprofit experience, some tips and tricks. I think my last one is if you have a lot of nuanced questions, I mean, FMA is here to help, but ask your lender to the extent that you have access to an actual human. You are developing what will be a very intimate relationship over the next 8 weeks with your lender. And I encourage you to continue to develop that relationship because you're going to have questions for them.
Yeah, I've also heard from some nonprofits that working with smaller banks have been more beneficial than working with large banks. But the smaller banks.
I wasn't sure if I was allowed to say that in a New York City centric call. But yes, I would agree that. And the key part about the small banks is that they often have a relationship manager that you can be emailing with directly as opposed to going through an online portal. But yes, I would agree that that is where we have seen the most success. And in this round 2 of funding, it was deliberately put in from a policy perspective that the smaller community banks had more access to resources up front. So.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I wanted to encourage the audience to remember that you can put in questions into the Q&A box and upvote the ones you would really like to have answered. One of the things that that has come up is around philanthropy and figuring out what the financial future looks like, not just for organizations, but the stakeholders who usually support these organizations. What are you seeing in terms of shifts emerging in philanthropy and how they're responding and what the implications might be for nonprofits as they're thinking about risk and resiliency?
Want me to start and then maybe
Katie, do you want to start? And I can, yeah, I'm sure we all have stuff to say on this. Yeah.
Exactly. I think that the headline, probably somewhat frustratingly, is that it really varies on the funder. And so if we put aside public funding for a minute on the government side, like we've talked about that a fair bit, looking at kind of institutional funding and maybe focusing on private philanthropy over corporate for at least what I'll share, is I think that there is a camp of philanthropies that have decided and they've never only understand the urgency of the moment, and they've been really responsive to the needs of the sector. And there's actually been a good number of organizations that have signed on to a pledge to say that they're going to convert their programmatic or restricted funding to general operating support, and that they actually are going to try to do as much as they can, guarantee another year of a multi-year grant, or if it's a 1-year grant, say the organization doesn't have to reapply, it just rolls into a 2nd-year grant as well. And there have been some groups doing really well with that, and that's been incredible. And there's been some amount of like advocacy amongst the philanthropic world around that. In my experience, and I'll be curious what other panelists think, is that tends to be smaller funders, particularly here in New York. Like this, it's either like Ford, of course, is pushing that, but then there's also they're not small, sorry to contradict myself, but that there's a lot of other smaller funders that kind of fund more locally in New York, and I'm sure I know this is happening also out west and other locales. And also there are a bunch of other big funders that aren't doing this or might be giving this lip service, but aren't actually making those shifts. And so the question becomes, how do you actually develop a conversation with your program officer and or point to other foundations that are doing this and to why they might be able to get comfortable with the idea of relaxing restrictions on grant money you already have, considering doing a renewal, just rolling into a next year of a grant to give you a little bit of ease, and even things like relaxing reporting requirements. So you can just either send something you already sent to another funder, or you can actually not have to give a report because they know you're just going to use the funds for whatever you need. But I think the reality is it takes a lot of like person to person customized conversations because every funder is different. And back to the point earlier on communicate that I think Tony made, funders, if you haven't already emailed all your funders to tell them how you're doing and what you need from them, I would encourage everybody to do that now.
Thanks, Katie. Tony, did you want to share a perspective?
Yeah, sure. And just so folks know, I'm slightly biased. I worked for foundations for the 10 years before FMA. And so, yeah, I can share a little bit. I think Katie actually hit most of what I would have highlighted in terms of the response that we're seeing from philanthropy. I think what's interesting is it is very foundation specific. Is there a leader who can challenge the status quo and the 20-year history that foundation has of why they've built the systems that they've built, and what incentives they've had to do so. I think the additional thing that we're seeing is that foundations are also thinking about capacity building in a different way. And I am curious to hear a little bit more from the nonprofit sector around what are the exact supports that people feel like they need right now. We're seeing a mix of folks wanting to be on educational opportunities like this. Peer learning is becoming more popular. Like, let's just get 8 CEOs together or 8 CFOs to like just feeling very lonely in this moment, and how can foundations provide like the table for that, even though the foundations themselves shouldn't be at the table, they can help set the table for it. And then, to Katie's point, how does philanthropy help organizations go through scenario planning processes in a way that will help tee them up for success, without, having to be in the middle of it again, but at least teeing that up. I think what I'm curious to watch for in philanthropy are a couple of things. One is we are realizing that as a result of COVID-19, systems thinking and complexity thinking are sort of winning right now. There are no linear lines around what's been happening with COVID. And the idea that if we just do X and then we do Y, it will lead to Z. We understand that in human behavior, it just doesn't always happen that linearly. And I think COVID-19 is proving that out. And so to the extent that funders had very clear theories of change that said, if I fund this, it will lead to this, which will lead to this, we know that that's not always proving to be the case. And so this idea of how do we work in complex environments and how do we think about the system overall, I think is going to become more important. I think the other is, I actually, and I'll be curious to see what people think about this, I actually think there's an opportunity here for the funder and grantee relationship to change as a result of COVID. Including in the human element about what's happening. With working from home and moving to Zoom, with kids in the background and new work schedules, there's actually an opportunity for the power dynamics, the level of empathy, and the cultural norms and philanthropy around white perfectionism to actually be challenged right now, because your program officer has their kids in the background too. And you get to this more empathetic moment that I'm actually really, as someone that delivers on a lot of video calls, my level of anxiety has significantly gone down since COVID, which actually allows me to show up in a different way. And I hope that ends up happening in the nonprofit sector as people build relationships with their funders. So those are a couple ideas. I have more, but I'll pause there for Chai.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I agree so much with what Katie and Tony already said. From my perspective, early on, philanthropy felt like a target of advocacy, and we were encouraged to see, like, Brooklyn Community Foundation was one of the first to provide emergency funding, and it tended to be the smaller community-based funders who were responding pretty quickly. And, you know, it's interesting, and it's true, like, really just depends on the funder. So we've heard some great things, we've heard some not so great things. We're very encouraged Open Society is filling in for, you know, the relief that didn't come to undocumented New Yorkers. But I think lifting restrictions to general operating support is like not that hard. And honestly, something people have been calling for a really long time. So that is like the lowest level. And I would like to just see a little bit more boldness from philanthropy, but I realized pretty early on that I didn't have capacity to continue to advocate against, or not to advocate like to philanthropy, because they just move too slowly, and things like government had to become our target. And I think that it just, like, what has been interesting from my vantage point is a lot of nonprofits are completely freaking out. And even when they were worried about closing, you know, foundations are not in that position. Yes, their endowments have taken a huge hit, but like they're not worried about closing in the same way that a lot of nonprofits have been. So it's just, they have very different experiences right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. You know, I was thinking that, you know, when we begin to lose funding or cut funding from nonprofits, sometimes we talk about how the organization won't survive. And the reality is that the services that those organizations will not survive, which means that communities that rely on those services and programs and people will, especially populations that are the most vulnerable, will not have those services that they need. And, you know, Tony, something you mentioned in terms of the level of empathy that seems to increase during this pandemic for so many populations. And maybe it's not leveling the playing field completely, but it's bringing sort of a degree of awareness around where people are living and who needs the most help and who is going to the front lines. It's just bringing a lot to light. And one of the questions that's coming up is around how can nonprofits communicate with the communities that they're in to let them know where they are, what the next steps are, and how can they stay visible with the people who are their constituents. So that's one aspect. But then the other aspect is, what's the best way to reach out to the people who make the decisions that impact where nonprofits can continue to grow or pivot. So not so much waiting around for a trickle down effect once the state or the federal government have decided certain policies, but how can we be working more on a trickle up effect in terms of what where we're sitting?
Shai, do you want to take that first, or do you want me to dive in first?
I'm kind of sitting with that. So why don't you go, Katie? Thank you.
Okay. Lon, I'm going to start with your second question because I think I've already forgotten part of the first. But with the second question, you know, I think there is a great potential right now for our sector to come together in a different way than we have in the past. And to be clear, I think we've actually come together in other crises in the past as well. But I think particularly right now, like what we're seeing happen on the ground in communities, everything from like the mutual aid groups that are cropping up, right? Like residents helping residents with what is needed, you know, within a particular building or within a neighborhood, is actually starting to happen organically with nonprofits too. In that sometimes out of necessity, right? Like restricted funding, increased needs, how do you actually partner in a way you didn't have to before when you can be working side by side in a neighborhood versus otherwise? But even again, I've had the luck of being in a couple conversations with groups of CEOs where they're saying like, we actually need a coordinating entity in this neighborhood or in this group, if it's a virtual group, right? It doesn't have to be a physical place-based, although it often is right now. And a call for like, how can we have one of our nonprofit or CBOs, community-based organizations, serving as that function? And by the way, can we get a funder, government or private foundation to fund that? And it's very clear that groups do not want that coordinating entity to be from the government, because we've tried that before. We had government tell us many, many times top down, and they don't know, they're not in with the community, nor are they trusted by the people who live there to actually make those and inform those decisions. But I'll say, I think that there's a real groundswell of acknowledgement and also desire amongst different nonprofits and community-based organizations to come together and work in a way that will actually do some of that ground up leadership that you're talking about, Lon. And I think the question becomes, how do we get that heard at levels of government where decisions are being made? Because if we even look at some of the members, again, I'll focus on New York City, members of different government task forces that have been put together for rebuilding and recovery, don't always include all of the voices of those who are going to be most impacted. And I think that for me is a big piece of this. Like, how are we all using our voices, particularly those like, for example, like a CRE or FMA or New York, where we work in intermediary roles and sometimes we have greater access to funders' ears on some of this stuff. How are we actually centering equity? And in this case, equity around, like, focused on those who are in the communities most impacted by this should have their voices heard and what the solutions and rebuilding strategies are. And so I think I'll say for me, these all go together, but I think that actually requires folks in all different types of organizations working together and then finding those willing ears in those that have the purse strings to actually make that stuff happen.
Thanks, Katie.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. That really helped me kind of think through a better position and answer on this, because I think we've been trying our best to do it, but it's just been so hectic that it's been hard to, like, there just hasn't been a quiet moment. So I feel like it was important to try and have those principles established before COVID, and some of the base building happening before COVID. So, you know, it just, for me, like, I'm a trained organizer, and you build your base and you issue identify from your base, and that takes work. It takes capacity, it takes like trust building. And I think that what we found through this is like, we are coming together because a lot of organizations are just eager to be connected and get answers and like do something. And I would say like a lot of stakeholders and individuals are looking for resources, so they're more connected to the resources within their communities. But I'm seeing a lot of just different ways, and kind of circling back to like the question of mission and service change. You know, we just really need to know what our communities need. It's as simple as that. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. Everybody's kind of pivoting to the different platforms to have that happen. But I think what's so critical that I just want to kind of reiterate that Katie mentioned is the coordination piece. You know, there's so much happening, and there's a lot of different advocacy efforts. And I think from my role at Nonprofit New York, what's been most important is to try and be a coordinator, to make sure, like, if we are all, you know, like, there are about 10 of us within our coalition who testified at the hearing yesterday on the city council's oversight hearing on disproportionate impacts, because there's a lot of things coming up that we needed to tell city council about, in particular some decisions they were making, and we had a very coordinated message. And that is really important, because if we appear to be uncoordinated, or if we are uncoordinated, we will be sending different messages to you know, decision makers, and they won't know which one to go with, and two, it can be easy for them to ignore all of us if we're not coordinated. And so I think, you know, those of us who are in like intermediary roles or in convening roles, like, it's important for us to be mindful of the influence we're able to have and speak on behalf of, and like what it means to be that's actually a very heavy responsibility. So what does accountability mean, and how do we continue to try and be accountable to who we are representing?
Thank you so much. So there's a question here, and I'm going to ask it the way that they wrote it, because I think there's something there, but you may understand it better than I do. But it says, please advise those of us who consult or advise foundations and nonprofits regarding contracting work instability and not qualifying for PPP or unemployment. My guess is the question is something around, what about people who don't qualify? What about or organizations that don't qualify for some of these funds that are supposed to help right now? What are their options?
So I think on the question about independent contractors for PPP, happy to be reached out to about that afterwards. You know, the SBA put out new guidance a couple of weeks ago that really helped clarify the role of independent contractors. We actually couldn't give any guidance out for the first 2-3 weeks of the program. And so I would just want to make sure before we totally write off PPP, given new guidance came out, that that's potentially an option. And the guidance that they put out, thankfully, was relatively clear in terms of like how to calculate how much you can apply for and how much will be forgiven. So I did include a link to our guide in the chat box. So that's my first suggestion. I think the other is around, as a contractor, how are you adopting your services in this moment? How are you helping folks? How are you thinking about what your special skills are and what your value add is to the nonprofits and the foundations that you serve, and making sure that your services are relevant for folks? I think the other is we are having to see some contractors do some pro bono work through this moment in order to be there for the nonprofit and the foundation when this gets over. And that may not be possible financially. For many folks, it's not. But it is still helping, you know, some of my consulting friends still get the fulfillment of being able to help out in this moment. And so those are a few thoughts. Chai and Katie, I don't know if you have other thoughts on as you've navigated this with your contractor friends.
Reading the question, I'm interpreting it as if like someone is a contractor themselves who, you know, they're not a nonprofit organization, so they can't apply for the PPP, may not also qualify for unemployment. I actually probably couldn't speak too well to it. I thought that gig workers and independent contractors there were specific ways that they were included in CARES, but honestly, so much of my attention has been on the organizational level.
Well, fortunately, our panelists have allowed us to share their emails with you at the end of this webinar. So if you have specific questions and you'd like to reach out to Chai, Katie, or Tony, then please feel free to do so. And you know, as we're ending, I wanted to share, or I wanted those of you who are still with us to use the chat box again. We're going to clear the questions, but to kind of be able to collectively share what we're learning in terms of nonprofit resiliency. So from the conversation today, what are your key insights? What are your action items and any lingering questions that you might have? So please use the Q&A box to share some of your thoughts. And while that is happening and people are upvoting on certain thoughts, I wanted to give the panelists a minute each to kind of close out the topic, and just thinking about the phases that Tony brought up earlier in terms of triage, stabilization, recovery, reinvention, and thriving. If you can share a little bit about what should be top of mind for our next phase, for the next phase of where you think we are headed. And you know, this time I think maybe it would be good if we went in reverse order. So if Chai could start and then pass to Katie and then to Tony, that would be great.
All right, this is a tough one. I mean, I think it would be great for this next phase of where we're going, because we don't know what this ends, if we could collectively envision or define what stability and sustainability looks like for us. What are those conditions so that we can advocate for them?
Okay.
Simple as that. No, I'm just kidding. Katie.
Succinct. You know, I think for me, it is number one, focus on what each of us as organizations can control. And to build on Shai's point, also just the world that we want to see on the other side of this, there will be something on the other side of this. And so therefore starting to lay the groundwork now for what that will be and what each way that we can as individual organizations and as a collective whole. The other thing I will say, because I didn't say this earlier, and I think it's important for everyone to keep in mind, there's been research done on, you know, what types of organizations really survive, if not thrive, through crises. Looking at things like 9/11 and Sandy, at least in New York City. And one of the key determinants of whether or not a group will make it through in a sustainable way through this, in addition, of course, there needs to be basic funds, right? Some of the very basic things. But a key thing is also how connected an organization is to others, to its communities, to its partners, to funders, of course, right? But like essentially, how connected are we as organizations? Because the more connected you are, the more folks who are going to make sure that you survive as an organization and ideally thriving and do what you need to do, be it to pivot services and or, you know, start doing different things. So the big takeaway I'd say from all of that is that through these next phases, organizations need to be out there. They need to be connecting. Don't hunker down under a rock to try to ride this out. Like we've got to actually all be continuing to build connections and ensure real relevancy and impact as we try to navigate a very difficult crisis, because that will, I think, pay off in the long term.
I guess the way I'll close this out is, you know, I drew out that graph of that chart of the steps in a linear way, and I would encourage you to remember that this is not going to happen in a linear fashion. I was watching The Good Place with my husband this week, and they talk about, like, in The Bad Place, what's the timeline like? And the timeline goes this way and this way and this way and this way. And to not beat yourself up or to not have shame if you feel like you're actually in a previous stage, because unfortunately, we're going to keep getting some bad news about what's happening from a wellness and a health perspective, and there'll be some setbacks, but there's also going to be positivity that's coming out that we keep seeing every day. And so just to not feel like going in these stages is a report card of like how much progress you've made, and just to recognize that, like, it's okay if today you're actually feeling like it's a triage day, and just to sort of know, like, there's some hope that things will get better, but it's okay if it feels like today was a little bit of a step back. We're all going through this in different ways, and we're all processing it in different ways, and that's okay.
Thank you so much, Tony. And thank you to all three of you, Tony, Chai, and Katie, for your time and your wealth of wisdom today. Thank you to our attendees, with special thanks to the extraordinary work of our nonprofits that you do every day and especially now. On the screen are the emails, and we will be sending out the recording of this video to everyone who registered. So please take care and have a nice day.